Hi, everyone. Phil Travis here, your professor for here at EOU. Um, this week's lesson is on the Civil War. We're going to break the Civil War into two chunks. We'll do 1861 to 63, this chunk, and then we'll have another one that'll do 1863 to 1865. So the Civil War, was an industrial war. It was a war that very much saw some of the old techniques being coupled with new technologies. The weapon of the war for most infantrymen, even though there were shotguns, people were using breech loading rifles, um, but by and large, the weapon of the war was the muzzle loading rifle, with of course using percussion cap. Um, this was a big advance from smooth bore weapons. A rifle has grooves, as I'm sure you guys know, have grooves on the inside of the barrel. And when coupled with the mini ball, which the mini ball was a development of a French soldier, the mini ball pictured here was designed so that when it fired, the base would expand and it would grip those grooves in the barrel, and it would spin the bullet out. And the result is a bullet that leaves the barrel at a much greater velocity and is far more accurate over a much greater range. These smoothbore muskets that had been used prior were very inaccurate, and that inaccuracy led to the usage of infantry formations that put infantry units close together, and infantry units that fought rather close quarters with other infantry units and fired volleys. The idea was you fire a mass volley at your opponent. You're more likely to hit them than if you're trying to sharpshoot them, because the muzzle loading smoothbore muskets were very inaccurate. They were not accurate. You still see those techniques used to a large degree in the Civil War. Though there are skirmish techniques are used. Skirmishes are when you did not have to wait until the order was given. You could fire at will. Skirmishes were usually smaller groups fighting in the rears or in the forward positions in battles. Artillery was a big development during the Civil War as well. Of course, artillery had been around, but artillery had been going through a lot of changes, and actually, artillery usage during the Civil War is incredibly diverse. There's a lot of different types of cannon and heavy artillery. You had the origin of exploding shells in some cases, though not by any means was that commonplace. What was more commonplace was the usage of artillery for close quarters use against infantry charges, in which they would employ things like the canister shot or grape shot, which were basically fired out of the cannon like shrapnel, pieces of metal and things like this that were designed to stop infantry charges. One of the factors that the rifle had on the battlefield was that the artillery for um, an offensive group oftentimes was negated by the long distance accuracy of rifles, which could sometimes pinpoint and target an enemy's artillery. Oftentimes, artillery was most effective used by the defending armies as they tried to fight in closer quarters with advancing infantry positions. Um, there's been some debate. Your book talks about there's been some debate over just to what extent um, the new technology was used with older formations and so forth. The position has been taken that most of the fighting that occurred during the Civil War occurred at distances that the smoothbore weapons would still have been effective. So it wasn't as though they were fighting from further distance away, but certainly the accuracy of the rifle, the firepower of the artillery, and these types of things in the canister shot would have resulted in far greater casualties, and did result in far greater casualties The casualty rates in the Civil War were unprecedented. No one had ever seen these types of casualty rates, and this is undoubtedly because of the use of close fighting, variations of older techniques, coupled with newer, more accurate, more deadly weapons. The cavalry during the Civil War rarely acted like a traditional cavalry. The cavalry rarely fought from horseback, as was traditional. Cavalry officers instead moved into position on flanks, for example, but then dismounted and fought more in the fashion of infantry units. The realities of the Civil War, presented here in this image, you see the ironclads, the Monitor, and the Merrimac engaging in Hampton Roads. You saw during the Civil War was an industrial war, and these ironclad ships were symptomatic of this new industrial reality, both in the world and also in warfare. These ironclads were steam powered, of course, and they were ships that were fitted out with thick iron walls that were very difficult to penetrate and very difficult to sink. Very much a precursor to your more armored navies of the early 20th century. It's a precursor to that. Obviously, they look very different. They are very different, but it's a precursor to the development of your major armored naval forces of the future. Medicine was incredibly antiquated during the Civil War. This is before antiseptics. And there's a general lack of understanding of germs and cleanliness and these types of things and infection. Medicine is one of the great advancements in warfare has been the advent of increasing medical techniques that have saved many lives. During the Civil War, for example, used bandages would be used over and over again, causing countless amounts of infections. Soldiers died from infections. Oftentimes, soldiers received wounds, and of course, the caliber weapons were larger caliber than what we might find in a lot of cases today. So a wound to the leg often might shatter a bone, causing infection, ultimately septicemia and death. In some cases, of course, the infection leads to gangrene, in which case they often would amputate wounded limbs. The amputations occurred without painkillers, without antiseptics, and without the use of painkillers, outside of maybe liquor. If you were lucky, I suppose. The way that they used to remove the limb was the doctor had a special, or the surgeon had and the surgeons looked much more like butchers. The surgeons in the war, I mean, they looked very much like butchers. They had a white, kind of apron in front of them, and they were generally covered in blood. But they had this kind of half circle-like instrument that they would go under the leg or the arm, and they would do a quick movement around that would sever all of the tissue, and then they would go in there with a basically like a hacksaw and saw through the bone, incredibly painful, obviously. So very, very antiquated medical technologies, and oftentimes people were left on the battlefields to die of wounds that in the future would have been survivable. New technologies, of course, ironclads, even submarines. Even though the submarine is certainly, not a decisive weapon, the CSS Hunley, which you can see if you go down to Charleston, actually, was one of the first operational submarines used in warfare. It becomes a war. The Civil War becomes a war of attrition as well. After 1862, you start to see the conflict increasingly become what we describe as an industrial war of attrition, in which the victor is the side who can sacrifice the most, can put the most into the conflict, and can starve the other of resources and the ability to fight. Of course, the Civil War was also a war in which families fought each other. There were groups like so-called Mountain Whites, some 50,000 of them from places like West Virginia, who fought in the Union. The costs of the war are incomprehensible. About 600,000 Americans were killed in that war. and that remains the most deadly American conflict ever. More Americans have died in the Civil War than any other war in the nation's history. World War II is second, of course, with about 450,000. Let's look at an image of Union artillerymen. Now, I'll show you another image of Union artillerymen from Yorktown in 1862, and you'll get an idea of just how different artillery could be. Here with a more traditional cannon, you'll see the siege cannon at Yorktown in a little bit, and it looks very, very different. So, Union advantages. You see here a map in the beige, obviously depicts the seceded southern states. In the green are the Union states, and of course in the dark green are the border states. And the border states are all those states that did not secede but had slaves, but were slave states. So the Union advantage, first of all, was one is manpower and population. Many more people lived in the North. The North was industrializing, which brought increased immigration from Europe and increased population. That industry also was an advantage because it will allow the North to produce the types of military supplies required to wage the kind of total war of attrition that the Civil War will become. Also, one advantage the North has is with these border states. These border states that don't secede, and Lincoln went to great lengths to keep these states in the Union because they were important. For one reason, it gave you a place from which you could attack Southern strengths in places like the Mississippi River, as well as right at the Southern capital, Richmond in Virginia. However, you also have issues in these states as in regarding railroad lines, but not only railroad lines. I mean, when you think about Maryland, I mean, if Maryland had seceded, the capital, Washington, D.C., would have been basically surrounded by Confederate states. And so it was really important to keep those border states in. And by keeping the border states in, that certainly served an advantage to the Union. The Union has a naval advantage as well. And has a wealth advantage, some 3/4 of the nation's wealth. Also, Abraham Lincoln, an exceptional leader in the executive office, and the fact that the North has a stable and established government. That's a big advantage for the North because the South is forming a government while it's fighting a war, basically. The North has a government that can carry out important things that are necessary for the conduct of the war. Things like declaring a blockade, raising an army. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus as well. Writ of habeas corpus, of course, is the constitutional right for you to be, free from being imprisoned without charge, basically. It was suspended in these border states, and Lincoln had Southern conspirators arrested, which was needed to keep some of those border states like Maryland from revolting and seceding themselves. Also, the power of the president to suspend free press and these types of things in these border areas. I know those sound like controversial types of actions, but we have to remember that the border states were integral from a standpoint of strategy. And the populations were somewhat divided in those areas, and it was really important that you keep those states from revolting and falling out of the Union. Of course, Confederacy military leadership pictured here, Robert E. Lee, also, of course, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart. The South had some exceptional leaders, particularly military leaders. I mean, their political leaders were actually bad, like Jefferson Davis. But military leaders, and it wasn't, and your book mentions this, that it's not to say that they had this massive advantage over the North in terms of all the Southern leaders were somehow good and the Northern leaders weren't. But it was the case that the South had a handful of leaders, particularly Lee, his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson and his cavalryman Jeb Stuart, and those three were really a very impressive group of leaders, especially Robert E. Lee, which really was an advantage for the South. And of course, Robert E. Lee was asked to be the commander of the Army of the Potomac for the North, and he chose to secede with Virginia. Virginia was a state that, of course, seceded after the fact, really after the war had begun, after it became clearly apparent that they would have to fight against the South. Was only when Virginia and, of course, Tennessee and North Carolina and Missouri wound up, or not Missouri, Arkansas wound up seceding, and Robert E. Lee made the difficult decision to not fight against the people that he considered his southern nation, his southern family, his southern section, and he chose instead to join the ranks of the Southern Confederacy. He first worked with Jefferson Davis in war planning, and then he joined relatively early on. He joined the Army of Northern Virginia and has become one of the most famous American military minds in the country's history. Other advantages, the Confederacy, generally it's accepted that they overall had probably better marksmen. They may have had better soldiers. There's some debate over that. The rebel yell is, of course, a term that refers to the kind of war cries that Southern soldiers sometimes let out when they launched an infantry charge. The biggest advantage I would say the Confederacy probably had is the fact that they were fighting a defensive war, which is always an easier thing to do than fight an offensive war. Of course, also nationalism. They were defending their homeland in their view, and they also believed they were defending their state's rights to secede, and what they believed was the kind of original idea of the Constitution. That was their belief. By contrast, Union soldiers too fought for what they believed the Constitution was all about, and Union soldiers too fought with great nationalism and pride to preserve the Union. But of course, they weren't in the same way defending their homeland. So perhaps nationalism slightly to a higher extent for the Southerners. Some of the disadvantages for the North, one of the disadvantages was difficulty finding good leadership. It really wasn't until Ulysses S. Grant that the United States finds, that Lincoln finds good leaders to lead his army. They have to defeat the South, which is more difficult. And you might say that their soldiers are slightly lower quality. There's some debate over that issue. In the South, of course, the South lacks industry. They have really no navy. To call it a weak navy is actually, giving them something. They really have no real navy to speak of. They're poor and vulnerable in terms of logistics. Their railroad lines, their capitals are located very close. Their capital is located close to the north. Their key railroad lines and ports are located oftentimes close to the north. So they have some vulnerable logistical issues. Slavery is too an issue because especially after emancipation, this will be a huge issue for them behind the rears of their fighting. The slave population, that many of them left their plantations, and some of them joined the fight against the North, against the South for the North. Jefferson Davis, too, was a very, very poor leader, and he created a lot of animosities within the Confederacy. The Confederacy, too, was a very young government. They were forming their government as the war was beginning, and that was a disadvantage, of course. States' rights, the idea of states' rights also made it difficult for Davis to exercise full authority when it came to things like taxation, conscription, and so forth. The objectives. The North's objective is basically to preserve the Union. Abolition does not begin as the unifying factor behind the war, and in fact, abolition was controversial. Had the war originally begun fought for abolition, it's true that most people in the North probably would have opposed it. But the goal was to preserve the Union for the North, and you preserve the Union by, we'll talk about some of the specific objectives in their strategy on the next slide. The South's objectives were to protect their sovereignty and their right as what they believed as voluntary participants in the United States to secede. Their primary goal was to protect the sovereignty of the Confederate States. The strategy for the South, so how do you win the war for the South? The strategy for the South is really to get the international community and the Union, of course, to recognize it as a legitimate and independent country. They believed they could do this first by catering to European powers. The British offered some kind of sort of, I guess, pseudo assistance to the South. The British didn't openly and directly assist the South, but there were the construction of some commerce raiders like the Alabama that actually captured quite a few U.S. merchant ships. Though after the Battle of Antietam, you will see Lord Palmerston exercise restraint over this issue as they will decide not to recognize the South. The French, too, overthrew the Mexican government and put the Austrian Archduke Maximilian in power in Mexico. Sorry for that typo. In 1863. So there was an international interest in the conflict, and the South did appeal to the international powers. And one of their goals was to get the international community to recognize it. And through that, encourage them to help them in the war and encourage them to force the Union to recognize them. The key thing in the actual fighting of the war for the South was that they sought to win major victories, threaten the capital, Washington, D.C., or major cities in the North, and force Washington to sign a treaty by winning major victories, potentially major victories on northern soil near the capital or in the capital. By contrast, the Union strategy, which was embodied really in what's called the Anaconda Plan, was on one side to blockade the South, to embargo them, so make it impossible for them to carry out the war, and to take the southern capital of Richmond. Initially, there was a great intent on the North to avoid civilian killing, avoid the population. Later, however, as the war develops into kind of a total war of attrition, there's also total war on the southern population, which was directed through emancipation in the southern states, destruction of farms, and of course, the most infamous case being Sherman's March to the Sea. And this happens as the war becomes more of a total war of attrition. Excuse me. Both the North and the South used conscription, the draft. The vast majority of Union troops were volunteers. The draft was largely used to encourage volunteers. There was some opposition to the draft, and there were some draft riots. There was also in both the North and the South, you could purchase an exemption to the draft and purchase exemption to military service. There's deserters on both sides. And by and large, in the South, conscription placed a much greater demand on the populace, as it was a smaller population, and it was more difficult for the South, which was substantially outnumbered militarily. It was more difficult for them to carry on through a long-term war. And so you saw conscription in 1862 for all those able-bodied men, 17 to 50. So it was a much more thorough demand on the populace in the South. This map shows you the Anaconda Plan as it's kind of in place. You can see the dark purple in the southern areas that goes down to New Orleans, which is the result of important victories like the Battle of Shiloh Church in 1862. And of course, the dotted line indicates the areas where which the blockade would have been placed around the South. And so the South is blockaded, and over the long run, this is going to be a key factor in depriving the South the ability to make war and ultimately forcing the South to succumb. The home fronts in the North, you have your first income tax. It's a wartime tax, so it's not a permanent thing. But they use income tax. They raise tariff duties. They print greenbacks, meaning currency that wasn't supported by gold or silver. There's bond sales. They establish a national bank. And in the North, there's also, for some, a wartime prosperity boom. It created the first real millionaire class in the North. You had the development of sewing machines, which created the uniforms for the soldiers. It's during this time that you actually have the development of traditionally what we think of as clothes sizes. Um, it's also in the North in 1859. We have the development of oil. We have discovery of oil in Pennsylvania, so-called Drake's Folly. Um, there's a lot of women in industry during the war, just as you saw during World War II and other American conflicts like World War One. Nurses like Dorothy D., Clara Barton, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell were revolutionary women in terms of developing improvements in sanitary conditions in hospitals and assisting fallen soldiers on the battlefields. The Southern home front experienced increased taxes, the printing of bluebacks, similar to the greenbacks, which ultimately they experienced runaway inflation as a result of this. Towards the end of the war, the Southern economy really collapsed. They suffered import issues. There were difficulty in organizing things because of arguments over states' rights. There was a loss in wealth, and cotton production decreases profoundly. Of course, the Civil War began on April 12th, 1861, when Southern forces besieged the fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. Fort Sumter was a federal garrison. It's located in the harbor of Charleston at the mouth of the harbor. And of course, South Carolina was really the first state to secede and one of the primary states advocating secession. At the beginning of the secession crisis, the South demanded Fort Sumter, and Lincoln refused to leave Fort Sumter, and he sent a non-military humanitarian resupply to the base to keep the people from being starved out. And the Southerners ultimately decided to besiege Fort Sumter in what was probably a mistake, because it gave the siege of Fort Sumter gave Lincoln and the Union the reason to declare war on the South, which had really not formally happened yet. And so it was a war that immediately started after this fort was besieged by the Southerners. And had the Southerners left the fort alone, it's difficult to imagine that Lincoln would have had the kind of political position to have been able to outright declare war. He very well might have, but this gave him a justification to say, now I have a right to declare war, and the South has somehow brought it upon them. So the first true battle of the Civil War was the Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run. Bull Run is the nearby stream. There's two ways of naming a lot of these battles. The North and South varied. One strategy was to name the battles after the nearest town, Manassas. The other, the nearest creek or river, Bull Run. The Battle of Manassas was designed to send General Irving McDowell with Union forces south to take, ultimately, the southern capital of Richmond, which was, of course, located, both of the capitals were located very close to each other. This was in July of 1861. The idea was that Irving McDowell, that his forces could advance and engage the Southern commander Beauregard's forces, which were encamped at Manassas. If he could defeat Beauregard's force, the idea was he could then win a major victory and move on Richmond. No one ever expected the Vietnam War. Listen to me. No one ever expected the Civil War to become a long, drawn-out kind of battle of attrition. No one expected it to last as long as it did. No one expected it to ravage the South the way that it did. And no one expected it to take the cost in human lives that it did. And people mainly thought that there might be a few battles and then there would be a treaty and it would be over. And certainly this held true with the Battle of Manassas. And many expected the Union forces to win an easy victory and the war would be over. I call it sometimes the picnic battle, because people came out to watch the battle expecting this Union victory and ultimate capture of Richmond. Of course, what happens is Joseph Johnson's forces were moved by train. The first movement of a major amount of troops to a battlefield by train ever, and um, together the two Southern forces defeated the Union forces at Manassas and sent the Union Army running in a very disorganized fashion. And people and the forces fled back to the capital city. It was a absolutely crushing defeat and victory for Beauregard, even though the Southern forces were not together enough to actually pursue them to the capital. But it was a quick victory for the South, and it served as a wake up call for the North, that there would be no quick victories, that there would be a need for a longer, more involved conflict. Before this, the people who went to serve with the Union were signed up for 3 months. After this, the Lincoln administration will learn that they have to conscript people for, or that they have to have people sign up for longer, generally a 3-year period. It also encouraged overconfidence from the South. In the South, there were increasing desertions after this, and enlistments dropped off as they kind of assumed that this war would be, more or less of an afterthought. So the Peninsula Campaign was the second real attempt and the most serious attempt so far in the summer of 1862 to snatch the southern capital of Richmond and hopefully win a quick victory. Though we don't know if actually capturing the southern capital would have resulted in an end of the war or not, but it would have been a great move in that way for the Union. The Northern forces, the Union forces, the Army of the Potomac, was led by General George B. McClellan. And General McClellan was noted for, he was very popular amongst his troops. He was an excellent drill master. He organized his troops very well. But he was also sort of like General William Howe from the Revolutionary War in that he was complacent. He was very, very wary of taking a huge amount of casualties on his troops, very wary about sacrificing his troops into battle. And so he tended to be complacent. He tended to act too slowly, and he was highly criticized for this. You also see here in this picture, this is Union forces that are sieging the enemy line, or the Confederate line at Yorktown in 1862. And you see here the difference in this kind of siege artillery versus the artillery that we saw earlier in the PowerPoint. This is a very innovative stage for artillery in warfare, and there's just numerous different types of artillery pieces that are used during the Civil War. McClellan's forces landed, you see here on the peninsula, you can kind of get an idea from this map of the campaign. McClellan's forces landed down here on the tip of the peninsula that comes out from the location of Richmond here in Virginia down to the Chesapeake Bay. And of course, McClellan was initially stopped by this enemy line at Yorktown. He had to fight in a siege here. He also deceived Lincoln and his cabinet about the amount of troops he was leaving behind. Lincoln's cabinet was very concerned that if he went down and conducted this operation, it would leave Washington vulnerable. And actually, Lincoln only approved the plan by having McClellan promise that he leave a certain amount of troops to protect Washington. And actually, they found out that McClellan had not left that number of troops, and Lincoln refused to allow one of the last dispatches of troops to land on the peninsula. Instead called them back to Washington to protect the capital. McClellan he was criticized highly for this. In addition, he really fails in the Peninsula Campaign to take the kind of initiative that might have been able to capture the capital. And to make it even worse, he's fighting Robert E. Lee, who is the new head of the Army of Northern Virginia. And Robert E. Lee, along with Jeb Stuart and Stonewall Jackson, were aggressive and offensive, and they really took the initiative. And in like the 7 Days Battle, Lee took extreme casualties, and he was also criticized for that, but he was successful. And he was very successful because, especially at this point, he was aggressive. And of course, Jeb Stuart famously rode around McClellan's forces, and McClellan was generally outmatched and outmaneuvered in the Peninsula Campaign. And it wound up being a moment in which McClellan will lose command of the Army of the Potomac for a period of time, though at the Battle of Antietam, several months later, you'll find McClellan back in charge. Lincoln had difficulty finding leadership that he could have faith in, and so he shuffled the ranks of his high command of the Army of the Potomac quite a bit as he searched out a good, reliable leader. And it really wasn't until Ulysses S. Grant in 1863 when Lincoln finally, 1863, 1864, when Lincoln really finds a general that he can feel confident in. So Antietam happens several months after the Peninsula Campaign in September of 1862. It's also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, and McClellan was back in command at Antietam. Now, the goal here for Lee pushed into Maryland, and his goal was, as we laid out the objectives in that earlier slide, his goal was to win a major offensive victory and force a treaty. So he wanted to threaten the capitals, or threaten Philadelphia, or threaten Baltimore, and in so doing, force the Union to agree to a treaty that would recognize the South. There's two invasions during the war. This is the first invasion of the North. The second one, of course, occurs with Gettysburg. As you read, the battle carried out, and Union troops found a Confederate battle plan. And the battle winds up being the bloodiest day of the war, with about 17,000 wounded and about 6,000 dead in one day. And Lee ultimately goes across, he has to return. It's technically a victory for the Union, though in terms of what happened on the battlefield, it was hard to give any one side the victory. But it really was a victory for the Union in a strategic sense, because Lee had to go back to Virginia after the battle. He left the battlefield first, albeit on his own volition. But the key to this was that neither the British or the French would recognize the South. And so they really, at this point, had failed to be able to successfully bring in international involvement. And so it really was a strategic victory for the North, despite the cost. There was also significant fighting in the West at this time, early on in the war, the West being the Mississippi River area. And, of course, Ulysses S. Grant was particularly famous for the Union in these campaigns. Grant kind of earned his claim to fame in the West before he was appointed to the Army of the Potomac. Grant, who was a West Point graduate, he had fought at the Mexican-American War, won a first victory at Fort Henry, and then, of course, at Shiloh Church on April 6th and 7th, 1862. Grant was ambushed, reinforced, wins a major victory, and after this leads to the capture of Memphis, of New Orleans, and Corinth, Mississippi. These were really significant locations to seize, and it gave control to the Union of the Mississippi West, which was a very significant part of the Union's plan of blockading the South and using access and control of the Mississippi to cut the South in half ultimately. Shiloh was also a massively deadly battle. The casualties were shocking, over 10,000 for each side. And this became an increasing norm of this new industrial warfare. No one had ever seen casualties in these kinds of numbers, and this was going to be the norm for the Civil War. It was an incredibly devastating conflict in terms of casualties. Here's that map again, just kind of dictating, showing to you the blockaded areas, as well as you can see in the purple the areas of the Mississippi that are taken control of by Grant, and these were taking control of areas like New Orleans. Were very, very important steps in facilitating the Union's attempt to effectively blockade the South and strangle it slowly. So by the end of 1862, you really see the Northern strategy become a strategy of total war, a war of attrition. It becomes a strategy to blockade and starve the South out. It became a strategy that targeted the Southern home front as much as it did the Southern Army, target the Southern economy. It becomes a total war of attrition. Emancipation is used first. It's first called in 1862. It is formally dictated on January 1st, 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation was used as a strategy. It was strategic to free the slaves in the seceded states. Lincoln did not enforce the proclamation in border states. It was designed as a strategic move against seceded states to basically create unrest within the states and undermine what's left of the plantation system. And of course, 1 in 7 slaves fled to Union lines. It wasn't a terribly popular decision in the North, and had the war been begun as a war to free the slaves, likely it would have been not supported in the North. But it does give Lincoln and the North an overall stronger moral position, internationally speaking. And this was another ultimate factor in encouraging international powers like the British to not support the South in favor of the Union. Of course, the British were sort of divided on that issue. Many of the aristocratic elements in Great Britain sort of related to the planter aristocracy in the South. The strategy of the North now becomes, by 1863, a total war strategy to control the Mississippi and through that cut the South in two and enhance a total blockade, to ravage Georgia and the Carolinas, cut them up from the inside. You'll see this with Sherman's March to the Sea, to capture the capital of Richmond, which occurs at the end, towards the end of the war, to use attrition to ultimately wear down the enemy's strengths. So by 1862, the Civil War has absolutely become a total war of attrition.